Good morning and welcome to Chapter 9 of our course on economics. We will look today at the government and the fiscal policy of the government. We'll look in particular at how the government can influence the economy. We'll look at the fiscal policy of the government and the multiplier effects that are attached to it. We'll look at the federal budget and then at how the economy can influence the government's budget. First, let's begin with a few definitions. The fiscal policy is the policy that dictates the government spending and taxing, as opposed to the monetary policy, which describes the behavior of the Federal Reserve concerning the nation's money supply, and this is something which we will explore in chapter number 10. The government in the economy acts through discretionary fiscal policy. That means the government changes the taxes and the spending as it deems fit on its own initiative. The government purchases, the net taxes and the disposable incomes are new concepts that are introduced in this chapter. The net taxes, which we will denote T, are the taxes paid by the firms and the households to the government. And because we are talking about net taxes, they are the taxes paid minus all the transfers that are coming from the government to the households. So this is really the amount that goes out to the government. The disposable income, or after-tax income, is therefore created after taxes have been paid. And it is simply the total income minus the taxes. The word says it very clearly. It is disposable income. This is the amount of income that is available for spending after you have paid your taxes. Disposable income, YD, is equal to total income minus taxes. Let's look now at an overall chart that describes how the government interferes in the economy, or intervenes in the economy rather. We know that there is a relationship between firms and households, which we describe in chapter number 8. Households consume, firms invest, and these consumption plus investment generates the aggregate expenditure. Well, the government also spends, also makes purchases. They are denoted here as G, and they add up to the aggregate expenditure. In exchange for the production and for the consumption that households generate, they work at firms and they receive income from these firms. But of course, part of the income is paid to the government as taxes, and what is left for the households is only the disposable income. What the households do not spend, they will save. The savings will flow through the financial markets, will flow back to the firms and to the government that both need to borrow money for their investment and their development. So we'll see now in detail how each of these items and each of these elements, the aggregate expenditures and the disposable income, are impacted by the government's intervention. So again, the government intervening changes the concept of income and aggregate expenditure. The disposable income, as we have seen, is now only the total income minus the taxes. And this is only what you can spend and or save. So the consumption and savings make up the disposable income. In other words, you cannot spend and or consume more than your disposable income because the rest has gone off in taxes. So the total income minus the taxes is what you can consume and or spend. In other words, the total income is made of consumption, savings and taxes. The aggregate expenditure, as we have said in the previous slide, is comprising of the consumption and investment, that is what is done by households and firms, but it is now also added or increased by the government spending or the government purchases. Aggregate expenditures are consumption plus investment plus government spending. The budget deficit is simply the difference between what the government purchases or spends and what the government collects or earns through taxes. Budget deficit is spending minus taxes. When the taxes are less than the spending, the government spends more than what it receives, it is in deficit. It can also, of course, happen that the government collects more than what it spends. It can happen that taxes are above spending. In that case, we obtain a negative budget deficit, which is actually called a budget surplus. So, the government intervening in the economy changes a lot of factors. The consumption function, which we described in our previous chapter, and which was simply written as consumption equals A plus B multiplied by Y being the income. So the consumption being a function of the income must now be rewritten into consumption equals A plus B multiplied by disposable income. Remember, we can only spend what we have left after we have spent taxes. So the consumption equation is rewritten as A plus B multiplied by income minus taxes. The planned investments are also impacted by the government. The government can steer or can influence companies into investing more or less by giving fiscal presence or fiscal advantages to investment. And therefore, the amount of investments which are carried out by the companies will be influenced by the government. And of course, the government can influence the economy by directly purchasing in the economy, by spending in the economy, by building roads, building hospitals, building schools. All of these are government spending in the economy. And we're going to see how it impacts the economy. The total income of the economy will therefore be made now not only of the consumption of the households and the investment of the companies, but will be also including the spending of the government. So if we take the consumption equation that we had in the last chapter, where consumption is equal to 100 plus 0.75 of income, now it must be disposable income that we input. So for any level of income, we have first of all to pay taxes, which we have here left at 100 for simplification purposes. And we have now a consumption which is a function of the disposable income that gives us 250, 400, 550 for respectively 300, 500 and 700 and so on. The savings are, as we have seen, can be negative or positive, but if we add to these consumption the planned investment spending by the firms at, let's say, 100 here in column 6, these 100 might indeed have been influenced by the decision or by the fiscal incentives of the government. And if we add in column 7 the government purchases of 200, we obtain a planned aggregate expenditure of consumption, column 4, plus investment, column 6, plus government purchases, column 7, which is higher or lower, of course, than the total income or output. And that creates an imbalance or an equilibrium or a surplus, depending on the effect. When there is a shortage, that means there is unplanned inventory decrease, the output will have to rise. When there is a surplus, that means that there has been excess inventory or unplanned inventory increases, and that means that the output will have to decline. We can see that picture more clearly in a chart, and we can see how the government intervention has a magnifying impact, just like the investment had in chapter 8 that we saw before the government intervened. Let us see here our blue line, which is the normal consumption line. It is slightly different from chapter 8 because we are now looking at disposable income and not flat income. We have introduced taxes, but from that simple consumption line, let's now introduce 200 of investment and government spending. 100 of investment, spurred by the incentive of the government, 100 of investment generated by firms, and 100 of additional G, government spending, input directly by the government. And what do we see? We see that the equilibrium of the economy finds place at an output level of 900. It has significantly increased from the balance that we had found in the previous chapter with that consumption line, which was at 400. So when the government intervenes by encouraging investment and by spending itself, it has a multiplying effect. The balance finds a new equilibrium point at 900. We can also look at the concept of equilibrium now that the government intervenes in the economy through the equation between savings and investment. We saw that without the government intervention, equilibrium was reached when savings was equal to investment. Now that the government intervenes, we can write that expression as follows: savings plus taxes equals investment plus government spending. We know that aggregate output income, Y, equals aggregate expenditures. We know that when the government intervenes, aggregate expenditures is now consumption plus investment plus government spending. And since aggregate output or income, Y, is equal also to consumption plus savings plus taxes, we have that equality between these two expressions, which can be then derived as savings plus taxes equals investment plus government spending. You can roughly interpret it as investments are funded by savings from the private sector. The government spending are funded by the taxes that the government collects. So we are seeing how the government, by influencing the amount of investments that are generated in the economy through its fiscal policies and fiscal incentives, and by its own investment or by its own spending in the economy, can have a multiplying effect on the net worth of the economy, on the wealth of the economy, on the income produced in this economy. This multiplier can be expressed through three different elements. We have the government spending multiplier, the tax multiplier, and the balanced budget multiplier. The government spending multiplier is exactly the same as what we saw in lecture number 8 about the investment multiplier. It is expressed as 1 divided by the marginal proportion of savings, and it is simply the ratio of change in the equilibrium level of output to a change in government spending. In other words, it expresses by how much is the income of the economy growing for every dollar of government spending injected in the economy. This table will show it. If the government spends 150 in the economy, you can see that the equilibrium point shifts to the bottom of the table. And if we look at it in the chart, we can see how the equilibrium finds its way in a higher level. We had our aggregate expenditure, which was the purple line here, which had found an equilibrium point at $900 of income. Add $50 of additional government expenses, you obtain now a new aggregate expenditure curve, the pink line here, the second line, the line on the top, which is now made of the consumption of the private sector, of the households, plus the investment of the firms, plus the new total spending of the government, which has indeed been increased by 50, and we can see that this new aggregate expenditure curve finds a new equilibrium at 1,100. In other words, $50 of additional spending in the economy generates $200 of additional income to the economy. There is a multiplying effect, just the same as what we saw with investment in lecture number 8. The tax multiplier effect works the other way around. As you can see, it is expressed here as the ratio of the marginal propensity to consume divided by the marginal propensity to save, but there is a minus sign in front of it. And it is quite understandable. If the taxes are increased, the economical actors, firms and households, have less money to spend and or to invest. And therefore, they will have a contractionary effect on the economy. But if taxes are reduced, then there is more money for people to spend, and that brings us back to the previous chart where there is additional spending in the economy and the economy finds its equilibrium point at a higher level. There is then positive multiplier effect. So the tax multiplier is a negative number. Taxes increase, reduce the wealth of the economy, reduce the income in the economy. Taxes reduction increase the wealth and the income in the economy. And of course, the government can choose to play on both sides. It can decide to increase spending and or to reduce or increase taxes. But if the government increases spending, then its budget deficit might increase as well because it is spending more. And therefore the government might choose to increase spending but increase tax at the same time to keep the budget deficit at the same level. If the government does so, the multiplying effect is cancelled out. The balanced budget multiplier becomes 1. In other words, when the government spends but increase taxes to offset the budget deficit impact of this increased spending, there is no multiplication. The multiplier is 1, and the effect in the economy will simply be the amount of additional spending. In other words, if the government spends an additional 50 but increases taxes by 50, there will be no multiplication effect on the additional amount of income created, and the additional income created for the economy will simply be 50, the same amount as what the government spent. Multiplier is 1. 50 multiplied by 1 is equal to 50. This is shown here by this table. If the government purchases increase to 300, but the taxes also increase to 300, then the equilibrium output finds its way at a level which is simply increased by 300, the amount of additional government spending, and not much further out on the chart. We can summarize the 3 ways the government can interact on this table. Increase government spending has a positive multiplying effect, and the multiplier is 1 divided by marginal propension of savings. The impact on the income or on the output of the economy will be the increased government spending divided by the marginal propensity of savings. And because the marginal propensity of savings is a number which is below 1, it will be increased government spending divided by something that is 0 point something, and then that number will be a higher number than the increase of government spending in the first place. So that has an increased impact on the income of the economy. The tax multiplier is negative, as we said. When taxes are increased, the income decreases. When taxes are decreased, the income increases to the tune of this ratio between the 2 marginal propensity. The balanced budget multiplier is simply the situation where the government increases spending but increases taxes as well, and therefore there is only a flat impact in the income of the economy. The increase of the income in the economy is simply the increase in the government spending. Let us look now at the federal budget, the budget of the United States. The federal budget is actually comprising three different elements. It is first a political document that dispenses favors to certain groups and regions from other regions. So basically it is transferring money from certain groups of people to other groups of people and from certain regions to other regions. It is a reflection of the goals that the government wants to achieve, and it is finally maybe an embodiment of some of the beliefs of how the government should manage the macroeconomy, if at all. The budget in 2007 looked like this. There was 2.7 trillion of receipts, most of which came from personal income tax and from contribution from social insurances. The expenditures were 2.9 trillion, mostly in transfers to person and in consumption expenditures, the government spending, the G that we described earlier, and that leaves the government here with a budget deficit of $220 billion. The budget deficit occurs when the expenditures are higher than the receipt. The federal budget surplus happens when the receipts are higher than the expenditures. What are the evolutions of this budget deficit and the fiscal policies over the last 2 decades? If we look since 1993, throughout the Clinton administrations and the Bush administrations, you can see that the fiscal pressure has increased significantly under Bush during his 2 terms on the American public, and the taxes level has increased, something that President Bush unwound very quickly. He reduced taxes very quickly, only to increase them again in 2003, and that was the consequence of most likely the war in Iraq. We can see that here, 2001, 9/11 events led to the war in Iraq. This war in Iraq had to be financed by the government, and it led the government to re-increase the taxes that it had reduced in the first place. The expenditures and the transfers of the government followed a similarly contrasted evolution. Under Clinton administrations, you can see that the expenditures, and more surprisingly for a Democrat president, the transfer declined, and they were only re-increased dramatically under the Bush presidency. Again, these expenditures rising here from 2003 onwards are the result of the war in Iraq. Consequently, with taxes increasing and expenditures decreasing under Clinton and the reverse happening under Bush, the budget deficit followed an inverted relationship. Clinton president managed to reduce the deficit of the federal budget and even led the budget into a surplus position from 1998. It lasted a few years until the effort of the war in Iraq led the budget back into a deficit situation. The government debt is simply the money that the federal government borrows to finance the budget deficit. When the budget is not in equilibrium and there is more expenses than receipt, the government has to borrow to finance the deficit. This is the federal debt, and the federal debt held by the privately owned sector is simply the amount of money that the private sector lends to the federal government to finance the budget deficit. And we can see that there is a perfectly inverted correlation between the amount of government debt and the amount of budget deficit. When the budget deficit declines and when the budget deficit actually turns into a surplus, there is less debt, less money borrowed by the federal government. When the federal government goes into deficit again, it starts increasing the level of money that it borrows from the private sector. It starts increasing its debt again. The government, as we have seen, influences the economy through the multipliers. But the government is also influenced by the economy. The budget of the government cannot control everything, and some elements in its budget are directly impacted by the state of the economy. The tax revenue, for instance, are dependent on the economic activity, and this economic activity is impacted by the level of the economy that the government cannot control. There are other expenditures in the budget that the government cannot control, which are linked directly to the economy. For example, transfer payments. Transfer payments are usually decreasing when the economy goes well, but they are increasing when the economy goes down. This is when people who are benefiting from the transfer need them most. Inflation picking up, which is what happens when the economy is doing well, will lead to higher expenses because whatever the government has planned to spend ends up costing more because of inflation. And last but not least, changes in interest rates will also have an impact on the amount of interest that the government pays on its debt and that the government cannot control. There are other automatic stabilizers that are elements which are embedded in the budget, which are automatically created in the budget to offset the evolution of the economy, and which therefore by definition cannot be controlled by the government, and which are only dictated by the state of the economy. And finally, there is what is called the fiscal drag. The fiscal drag is the negative effect that can happen to some people who have done well and who have increased their wealth through economic expansion, but which therefore find themselves in a higher tax bracket and which end up paying more taxes, which has then in turn a negative effect on the contribution that they can have to the economy. A full employment budget is a budget that would happen if the economy was functioning at full employment rate. That means at full capacity. If the government ends up with a deficit, even when the economy is functioning at full capacity, it means that the government has a structural deficit. And that is not a very good position to be in. It basically means that the government is living above its mean. It is structurally spending more than what it earns, which is different when the deficit is cyclical. A cyclical deficit just occurs because the economy has entered a down phase and therefore the government collects less revenues. We can assume that after the down phase, the economy will pick up again and that the government will then in turn be collecting more than what it earns. So a cyclical deficit can be accepted because it's part and parcel of the economic cycles. A structural deficit points at something which is more serious. It points at as a government which is spending more than what it earns regardless of the state of the economy. It is a structural situation. This last slide recapitulates the new concepts that we have seen in this session. Important definitions to remember: the disposable income, which is the total income minus the taxes; the aggregate expenditure, once the government intervenes in the economy, becomes the consumption of the private sector of the households, plus the investment of the firms, plus the government spending. The government budget, deficit budget, which is the spending made by the government minus the tax collected by the government. The equilibrium in an economy where the government intervenes is found where the income or the output of the economy is equal to the consumption of the households plus the investment of the firms plus the government spending. In an economy where the government intervenes, savings plus taxes equal investment plus government spending. Again, roughly speaking, think that investments are funded by savings of the private sectors, government spending are funded by taxes, and the government, lastly, can intervene through the economy in three different ways. It can intervene by spending, in which case there is the impact of the government spending multiplier. 50 additional spending by the government generates 200 of additional income for the economy. The economic multiplier is basically dividing the impact or the government spending by the marginal propension of savings. The tax multiplier, which is a negative multiplier, increased tax, less income for the economy, reduced tax, more income for the economy. And the balanced budget multiplier of 1, saying that when the government spends in the economy but raises tax to leave its balanced budget in place, then the impact on the income of the economy is simply the amount of the spending injected by the government. So this concludes our session number 9. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.